A man walks through Jerusalem after dark, and he is trying very hard not to be seen. He is not a thief. He is not running from soldiers. He is one of the most respected men in the city, a Pharisee, a member of the ruling council of 70 men who decide what is lawful and what is not. He has spent his whole life being seen, being consulted, being deferred to, and tonight he is doing everything in his power to make sure no one sees him at all. The streets are narrow and unlit. Every footstep echoes off stone walls that have heard 1,000 years of history. He keeps his hood pulled low, glancing at every corner before he crosses it, the way a man does when he cannot afford to be recognized. Somewhere behind him, the city he has spent his whole life serving is asleep. Ahead of him is a door that belongs to a carpenter's son from a town nobody respects. He knocks anyway. You already know how this story is supposed to end. Somebody tells you to get born again, you nod, maybe you even say it about yourself at a dinner party, and you move on with your life. It sounds like a phrase you already own. But the first man who ever heard it did not nod. He did not move on. He stood there in the dark, confused, almost offended, asking the most respected teacher in Jerusalem how, exactly, a grown man is supposed to climb back inside his mother. Stay with me, because that reaction is the whole point of this video. This is not a story about a phrase you say to unlock heaven. This is not a story about an emotional high you're supposed to feel on command. This is not a story about a box you check on a religious survey. This is a story about a brilliant, powerful, deeply religious man who walked away from Jesus more confused than when he arrived, and about what he had actually just been told. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly what confused him. You will understand the two Greek words hiding underneath the English phrase, born again, and why the man who first heard them couldn't be blamed for getting them wrong. And you will understand what happened to this man over the following months, because he does not disappear from the story. He comes back, twice. And the second time, he is not hiding in the dark anymore. His name is Nicodemus. And nothing about this conversation is what you think it is. Let's go back to the door. To understand why Nicodemus is standing outside it at night, you need to understand who he actually is. He is not a curious bystander. He is a Pharisee, and in first century Jerusalem, that word means something very specific. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing decades after these events, describes the Pharisees as the most exact and demanding interpreters of Jewish law in the entire nation. They did not simply follow the commandments. They built walls of extra rules around the commandments so that no one under their care would ever come close to breaking one. If you wanted the sharpest legal mind in Jerusalem, you asked a Pharisee. And Nicodemus was not just any Pharisee. The text calls him a ruler of the Jews, almost certainly a member of the Sanhedrin, the 71-man council that functioned as the Supreme Court of the nation. Picture a Supreme Court justice. Picture a senior theology professor. Picture a respected judge. Now combine all three into one man, and you start to understand what it cost Nicodemus to knock on that door. You can imagine what was running through his mind as he walked those dark streets alone. His colleagues had already started whispering about this young rabbi from Galilee, a nobody town, an embarrassing accent, no formal training. Jerusalem in this era was a city under Roman occupation, and the Sanhedrin's authority existed only because Rome allowed it to exist. Every council member knew how thin that permission was, and how easily a popular new teacher stirring up crowds could threaten the fragile arrangement they all depended on. If anyone from the council saw Nicodemus at that door, his reputation would take damage he might never repair, and worse, his colleagues might start asking whether his loyalties belonged where they were supposed to belong. And yet here he is anyway, alone, without an assistant, without a single witness he could call on if something went wrong. Something about this Jesus had gotten under his skin enough to risk all of it. He opens with flattery, or maybe it's sincerity. It's hard to know with a man this careful. "Rabbi," he says, "we know you are a teacher who has come from God. No one could perform the signs you perform unless God were with him." It's a respectful opening, a safe opening. The kind of sentence a trained debater uses to open a conversation without committing to anything yet. Jesus doesn't let him finish setting the table. He does not respond to the compliment with a compliment of his own. He does not ask about Nicodemus's family, or his position, or how the council has been these last few months. He skips past every normal social gesture entirely and says something that must have landed like a slap. Unless a man is born times anōthen, he cannot see the kingdom of God. No greeting exchanged first. No warm-up. Just a sentence dropped into the space between them like a stone into still water. Here's what most people miss. That word, anōthen, is doing two jobs at once, and Jesus almost certainly meant both of them. In Greek, anōthen times can mean again, a repeat, a second time. But it can also mean from above, meaning from heaven itself, not from earth at all. Any English Bible you open has to pick one translation and print it. Some pick born again. Others pick born from above. But the word Jesus actually used carries both meanings folded into a single sound, and there is no equivalent word in English that does the same thing. Jesus was not choosing between two ideas. He was saying something no single English phrase could ever fully capture. Nicodemus, brilliant as he is, grabs the wrong handle. He hears again, and his mind goes straight to the most literal, physical reading available. How can a man be born when he is old? He asks. Can he enter his mother's womb a second time and be born? Read that question again. This is not a stupid man. This is the sharpest legal mind on the council, reduced to asking about wombs, because the words being used are being used in a way his entire education never prepared him for. You can feel the humiliation in that question. A man used to being the smartest person in every room he enters, suddenly sounding like a child who has misunderstood a joke. But it gets stranger, because Jesus does not soften the blow. He doubles down. Unless someone is born of water and the Spirit, Jesus tells him, that person cannot enter the kingdom of God. What is born of flesh is flesh. What is born of spirit is spirit. Do not be surprised that I told you that you must be born times anōthen. Even the verb Jesus uses carries weight. Most readers skip past. The Greek word behind born here is times genā, a word that means to bring forth life, to father a child into existence. It is not a word for improvement. It is not a word for trying harder. It describes an origin, the way a birth certificate describes an origin, not a resume. What is born of flesh, Jesus says, is flesh. What is born of spirit is spirit. You cannot upgrade flesh into spirit through effort any more than a stone can practice its way into becoming a tree. It requires a different kind of beginning entirely times genā, a fathering, a genuine origin, not a renovation. And then Jesus goes further still, into an image just as slippery as the first one. The wind, he says, blows wherever it wants. You hear the sound of it, you feel it against your skin, but you cannot see where it comes from, and you cannot see where it is going. So it is with everyone who is born of the Spirit. Here's the part nobody tells you. In Greek, the word for wind and the word for spirit are the exact same word times pneuma. Jesus is not simply making a poetic comparison between two unrelated things. He is using a single word that means both at once. The same trick he pulled with times anōthen, times a moment earlier. Twice now, in one short conversation, Jesus has reached for a Greek word with a double meaning and let both meanings sit inside the sentence at the same time. That is not an accident. That is a teacher who is showing Nicodemus something about how God works invisible, uncontrollable, and yet undeniably real, the way you can feel wind on your face without ever holding it in your hand. Think about the last time you stood outside on a genuinely windy day. You did not see the wind itself. You saw a flag snap sideways, or a tree bend, or dust lift off the ground and scatter. The wind proved itself through what it moved, never by showing itself directly. Jesus is telling a man whose entire career runs on precise definitions and airtight categories that this is exactly how the Spirit works too. You will not get a diagram. You will see a life bend and move in ways it never used to. And that will have to be evidence enough. Nicodemus asks the only question left available to him. How can these things be? And this is where Jesus stops being gentle. You are the teacher of Israel, Jesus says, and you do not understand this? That line only lands with its full weight once you know what Nicodemus should have already known. Centuries earlier, in the misery of exile in Babylon, far from Jerusalem and everything familiar, the prophet Ezekiel had written down a promise from God to his people that one day God would sprinkle clean water on them, wash them of everything unclean, remove their hard, stone-like hearts, and place a brand new spirit inside them. Water, spirit, new life replacing old life. It's sitting right there in Ezekiel, in a scroll Nicodemus would have read, memorized, and probably taught to students of his own. You have to remember, too, that water was not a strange or foreign idea to a Pharisee. Ritual washing was part of the daily rhythm of his life. Pharisees immersed themselves in pools called mikvahs before entering the temple, before handling sacred texts, before countless ordinary moments a modern reader would never think required washing at all. Nicodemus had stepped into water thousands of times in his life, believing each time that it made him clean enough to stand before God. Jesus was not handing him an unfamiliar ritual. He was telling him that the washing he already knew by heart was only ever meant to point towards something water alone could never finish. Jesus is not introducing a brand new religious concept out of nowhere. He is pointing Nicodemus back to a promise that was always inside his own scriptures, wrapped inside a ritual he performed without ever asking what it was actually for, and asking why the most respected teacher in Jerusalem missed it. And this is where it gets remarkable. Nicodemus's confusion was never really about vocabulary. It was about category. He came expecting a conversation between two teachers, comparing notes on the law. What he got instead was an invitation into something he could not study, his way into something that would have to happen times to times him, not something he could simply understand and file away. If this video is helping you see this familiar story with new eyes, take a second right now to like it and subscribe, because we are only about a third of the way into everything Nicodemus is about to learn. What comes next widens this conversation from one confused man in a dark room to an entire nation, and eventually to the whole world, and it gets more remarkable from here. Because the stakes in this conversation are not staying small. What started as one man's private confusion about words is about to widen into something that reaches the entire nation, and then the entire world. Consider what it would have meant if Nicodemus, teacher of Israel, could not enter the kingdom of God on the strength of his own religious credentials. If the sharpest legal mind on the council needed the same thing, an uneducated fisherman needed, the same thing a Roman soldier needed, the same thing a woman with a reputation needed, then something enormous had just shifted. The old measuring stick, the one built out of lineage and law-keeping and decades of study, was no longer the measuring stick that mattered. And if that was true for Nicodemus, it was true for every teacher like him, true for the whole council, true for the whole nation that had built its identity around that measuring stick for centuries. For generations, the people of Israel had understood themselves through bloodline and birthright, descendants of Abraham, keepers of the covenant, set apart from every other nation on earth by ancestry alone. That identity was not a small thing to question. It was the foundation everything else stood on. And Jesus, in one quiet nighttime conversation with one member of one council, had just suggested that ancestry was never going to be enough. Not for Nicodemus. Not for the whole nation standing behind him. What began as a private, almost embarrassing misunderstanding about wombs had widened, in a matter of sentences, into a claim large enough to unsettle everything an entire people believed about their own belonging. Pay attention to this, because Jesus is not finished widening the picture. He reaches back even further than Ezekiel now, all the way to a strange and uncomfortable memory buried in the book of Numbers. Centuries before Nicodemus was born, the people of Israel were crossing the wilderness on their way toward a land they had been promised, and they had grown exhausted and bitter along the way. They complained about the food. They complained about the water. They complained loudly enough and long enough that venomous snakes began moving through the camp at night, and people were dying. Mothers, fathers, children, bitten in their tents, with no warning and no cure. The camp that once complained about mere discomfort was now burying its own people, and when they finally cried out for help, God did not tell Moses to remove the snakes. He told him to do something that sounds almost backwards. Build a bronze snake, the very image of the thing killing them, and lift it up high on a pole where the whole camp could see it from any direction. Anyone who had been bitten only had to turn their head and look at it, and they would live, not touch it, not perform a ritual over it, not even walk toward it, just look and live. Picture what that must have actually felt like inside a dying man's tent. The poison already moving through his blood. His family kneeling beside him, helpless, having tried everything they knew how to try. and someone outside calling in that there is a bronze snake on a pole at the center of camp, and all he has to do is turn his head. No strength required, no payment required, just the smallest possible movement a human body can make. A turned head, lifted eyes standing between him and staying alive. Jesus tells Nicodemus that the Son of Man must be lifted up in exactly the same way, so that everyone who looks to him, everyone who believes, will have life that does not end. And then comes the sentence you have almost certainly heard before it ever had this context attached to it. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, so that everyone who believes in him would not perish, but have life without end. That sentence was never a standalone greeting card verse floating free in space. It is the answer to the exact confusion Nicodemus walked in with. He came asking how a grown man gets born a second time. He is leaving with an answer that stretches from a bronze snake in the wilderness all the way to the entire world. And every single stop along the way is aimed at rescuing people who cannot rescue themselves, the same way a dying man in the wilderness could not cure his own snake bite. He could only look up. There's one more thing you need to know, because the conversation itself is not where this story ends. This is not a story about a number. This is not a story about a single verse people memorize and move past. This is not a story about a clever wordplay that only works in Greek. This is a story about what actually happened to the man who heard it. Now watch what happens next, because Nicodemus does not vanish after this nighttime conversation. He resurfaces twice more in the story, and both times he has moved a little further into the light. The first time, months later, the ruling council is furious with Jesus and moving to have him arrested without so much as a hearing. And in the middle of that room, one voice speaks up. It is Nicodemus. He does not announce that he believes. Not yet, not out loud, not fully. He simply asks a careful, lawyerly question. Does our law condemn a man before it even hears him? It's a small thing, a crack in the door, but it costs him something, because his own colleagues turn on him for asking it, accusing him of being a secret sympathizer from backward Galilee himself. Hold that thought, because a man who once came under cover of darkness because he could not risk being seen with Jesus is now willing to be mocked in open daylight for defending him. Something moved in Nicodemus between that nighttime doorway and this council chamber. Something began to be born in him. Here is where the pattern most people never notice becomes impossible to ignore. In the centuries since, the phrase, born again, has traveled a long way from that dark street in Jerusalem. That same year, a man who had helped bring down a presidency published a small book about his own life. He had been a hard-driving political operator swept up in the Watergate scandal, and he wrote about the strange, unraveling months that led him from disgrace to prison to a faith he had never expected to need. He called the book by the two words this whole video has been circling: born again. Around the very same season, an American presidential candidate sat for a magazine interview and used the same phrase to describe his own faith in plain, public language. Almost overnight, journalists across the country scrambled to figure out what the term even meant, dusting off theology textbooks in newsrooms that had never needed them before. Within months, born again had become a label, a demographic, a box on a survey, a shorthand people used to sort each other into categories. The phrase Jesus spoke privately to a confused Pharisee in the dark had become, 2,000 years later, something you could check on a form. And here's what gets lost every single time that happens. A label describes what someone already is. But times anōthen times was never a label. It was an invitation into something that had to happen to a person, the same way wind moves without anyone controlling it, the same way a dying man in the wilderness had nothing to offer except a willingness to look up. You cannot check a box your way into that. You can only receive it. Somewhere between a dark street in Jerusalem and a magazine interview in 1976, a word that meant again and from above at the same time got flattened down into a single, tidy, checkable identity. The mystery survived 2,000 years of copying and translating and preaching. What it did not survive, in the popular imagination at least, was a few decades of political shorthand, which brings us to the third and final time we meet Nicodemus, and it is the moment that resolves everything this story has been carrying since the beginning. Jesus has died on a Roman cross. His closest followers have scattered, terrified, hiding exactly the way Nicodemus once hid outside a doorway in the dark. And into that fear and abandonment walks Nicodemus, this time in broad daylight, in full view of anyone who wants to look, carrying 75 pounds of burial spices, myrrh and aloes, enough to bury a king. Any soldier, any priest, any council colleague passing by could see exactly who he was and exactly what he was doing. He and Joseph of Arimathea wrapped the body of Jesus themselves, winding the spices into the linen with their own hands, and lay it in a borrowed tomb. No more careful questions. No more careful timing. No more shadows to hide inside. The man who once could not bring himself to be seen near Jesus is now kneeling beside his dead body in public, spending a small fortune to honor him, risking everything that once mattered to him, his reputation, his seat on the council, the respect of the only world he had ever known. He gets nothing back for this. Jesus cannot thank him. Jesus cannot even see him do it. Nicodemus does it anyway, and that is exactly the point. That is what being born times anōthen times actually looks like. Not a phrase spoken once at a door in the dark. A slow, costly, unmistakable turning from hiding to standing, from questions to spices, from a man who needed everything explained to a man who acted without needing anything explained at all. So here is what this story actually leaves you with. First, the truth. Born again was never meant to describe one clean, translatable idea. The word Jesus used, anōthen, carried again, and from above, folded into a single breath, and every English Bible has to choose one word and lose the other. Whatever phrase your church or your culture handed you, know that the original conversation was stranger, richer, and more layered than any single English sentence can hold. Second, what this means for you. If the sharpest legal mind in Jerusalem could not think, study, or argue his way into this, then neither can you. Whatever credentials you're leaning on, how much you know, how long you've attended, how good you've been, how many years you've called yourself a believer, none of it was ever the entry price. Maybe you grew up in church and you've said the words 100 times without ever slowing down long enough to ask what they meant. Maybe you're the opposite, you've never set foot in one, and you've assumed this whole conversation was built for people more religious than you. Nicodemus was both of those people at once, the most religious man in the room and still, by his own confused questions, completely on the outside of what Jesus was describing. The invitation was never about what you bring. It was about what you're willing to receive, the way a dying man in the wilderness had nothing to offer except a willingness to lift his eyes. And third, this is the one to sit with. Nicodemus did not understand everything the night he knocked on that door. He walked away confused, embarrassed, still holding half his old assumptions. And Jesus let him leave that way. The change did not happen all at once in a single dramatic moment you could point to and circle on a calendar. It happened slowly, across months, across 3 separate appearances in the story, until a man who once hid in darkness was standing in the open, holding 75 pounds of spices for a dead man he had once been too afraid to be seen with. If you're still confused, still holding half your old assumptions, still standing in your own version of that dark doorway, that does not disqualify you. It may simply mean your story, like his, is still being written. Nicodemus needed a nighttime conversation, a council room confrontation, and a public burial before the transformation was finished. Nobody handed him a fast track. Nobody expected him to arrive fully formed on the first night. If it took him that long, in the direct presence of Jesus himself, there is no reason to believe it should be instant for you either. Which of the 3 appearances of Nicodemus hit you hardest? The frightened man at the door, the lone voice in the council room, or the man carrying spices in broad daylight? Tell me below, because the man who once needed everything explained to him ended up needing nothing explained at all. He simply lifted his eyes and he lived.